Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. We will be starting in about a minute or so time, just waiting for more people to join us. In the meantime, it'd be really quite great if people wanted to just pop in the chat box who they are, what their organizations are, what organizations they're from. That would be really great. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. My name is Eja Sangbedo, and I'm the Director of Partnerships at Simprints. I wanted to welcome you to the launch of Simprints' latest initiative, which is the Responsible Biometric Deployment Handbook. Simprints is a non-profit tech for dev company on a mission to improve the lives of the world's poorest and most vulnerable citizens. With 850 million people globally lacking a formal identity, we provide people with an ethical, inclusive, and safe digital identity to ensure that every vaccine, every dollar, and every public good reaches those who need it the most. Today, we're sharing a number of best practices that we've learned over the years about deploying biometrics tools responsibly in frontline humanitarian and development settings. I would like to welcome Elizabeth Shaughnessy, who is a digital programs lead at Oxfam, Sam Jeffries, head of biometrics at UNCHR, the UN Refugee Agency, Marissa Nordentoft, responsible data lead at Simprints, and James Eaton Lee, who was the former director of privacy, responsible data and risk at Simprints. They're going to be making up the panel today. Over the next 40 minutes or so, our expert panel will outline the inception and the intent of the handbook and review the structure of the guidance. They will draw out key takeaways from this essential resource and touch on how your organizations can incorporate this guidance into your work practically. We're going to try and preserve about 20 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A session for Q&A. So if you do have any questions as a panel speaking, please pop them into the chat and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can before the end of the session. Finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to the steering committee, of which Sam and Elizabeth are members, and the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab for the kind support for this project. One last thing before I hand over is please keep yourself muted through the course of this session unless you're called on to speak. I'll hand over to James, who will be leading us through the discussions. Thank you very much. James, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. My name is James Eaton Lee. I'm the Chief Security Officer of an organisation called NetHope, consortium of some of the world's largest NGOs, and I was the Director of Privacy at Simprints when we wrote this handbook. I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about where the project came from, what the handbook is, and how we hope that you can use it, and then we'll hear from our fantastic panelists on some of their perspectives. Biometrics in humanitarian contexts have been a theme in my professional career for several years, as they will have been for many of you, starting in Oxfam, where I worked prior to Simprints, where we did various bits of work within the broader ecosystem, in a space that felt a bit like a sort of protracted moral crisis regarding the adoption of emerging technologies at all, and in particular biometrics. Today, we probably wouldn't call biometrics an emerging technology. There are a huge number of humanitarian and broader development users using and applying biometrics and getting value from them. We have some of them joining us today. But this question of how to use biometrics safely seems to kind of persist, inevitably stoked when something goes wrong, the most signal moment perhaps being the leave behind of biometric data in Afghanistan. And it's an important question. It's the right one to continue asking. The fact notwithstanding that many implementers will tell you that biometrics do add value, that they can be implemented safely, and that they're already doing it. But we know if we can't answer the question well as a community, even if some aspects of our practice may be entirely safe, that itself is a problem. It's difficult to conclude that biometric safety is truly a solved problem if we can't align, agree, or articulate how. And that's part of the motivation for this project in the first place, that we wanted to take some of the fantastic existing guidance and articulate it into something slightly more structured. On this slide, you can see some of the principles that we laid down when we started writing it, taken from the introduction of the guidance itself. We brought into our work effectively an assertion that we thought biometric data and applications are sometimes useful, that they can solve data and other problems in society elegantly if they're used in the right way. And the fact that the tech has stuck around and is in use by many of us, I think seems to make this a relatively unremarkable observation. And yet we often don't think about utility and value. The exploitation of value in emerging tech always seems to kind of drive ahead of thinking about the societal implications. And although it's not the topic of our discussion today, you can see this happening currently with the kind of ongoing public discussion about generative AI. So thinking about this sort of literature and good practice really was one of the core principles that we brought into the guidance, that we know the technology is useful, but we hear we know not only that they can be misused, but we also hear the voices of communities who are concerned. The distress or perception of address is itself a sort of ethical or a privacy problem. And so we came to this conclusion that we know implementers need not only better guidance, but better communally held common guidance, which allows us to align better as we think about using this technology as a sort of ubiquitous part of our lives as digital humanitarians. So there are a few themes here before I sort of move into kind of talking through the structure of the guidance that I really want to kind of punch down on. Firstly, this point at the beginning, biometric data and applications are sometimes useful. There's an implication there that assessing need and benefit is a really critical part of the way that you use tech. It is a core component of your safety journey with biometrics or any other technology, that you're really clear how you do that need and benefit analysis, that it's integrated into your work. Secondly, that distress and those misgivings are important, and addressing them, whether it's by being transparent, accountable, responsive, engaging with communities, is itself important. And lastly, that word ongoing rights respecting decision making. This isn't just about collection. Being rights respecting safe implementers means that you consistently reassess when the political circumstances change, when your funding changes or your partnerships evolve, and implementing safeguards that adapt to the risk, whatever those might be. And the question that we've left at the bottom of the introduction is the question at the bottom of the slide, which we think is a sort of North Star for implementers and adopters. Does this remain effective, safe, and necessary? Is there ongoing benefit to the people I'm working with? Can I explain, and am I explaining how and why that benefit is derived and delivered? If we can move to the next slide. I've mentioned community and ecosystem a couple of times already. We're enormously grateful not only to the IBM Notre Dame Tech Ethics Lab who funded the project, but also the incredibly wise steering committee, both collectively and individually far wiser than me, and whose input was absolutely vital to getting the project off the ground and successfully completing it. And I will take credit for any of the mistakes that remain in the guidance. Not only in terms of the subject matter, but also in terms of what we want to do with the handbook after its launch. We couldn't with any integrity claim to propose this as any sort of straw man or basis for future collaboration without some roots into a broader ecosystem. And we hoped when writing the guidance, and I know it's a view shared by some, perhaps all of the steering committee, that we can use it as a helpful bridge to more communally held guidance and wisdom, making safe biometrics not just common, but also something that's communal. So we can align not only on good practice, but also be clear what isn't and look forward to more structure in future. Any humanitarians in the room will be familiar with things like the SPHERE standards. Data protection practitioners will know that in the GDPR, there's provision for sectoral codes of conduct, this vision that spaces, that sectors can start to self-regulate, can start to build practice that is applicable to them. We have no such constructs currently in this space, and it would be out of reach and probably arrogant to suggest that we could write them today, but perhaps this is a rung on a ladder that gets us towards that kind of next generation of structure and makes the debate a little bit more nuanced. But on to practicalities. What is this guidance? Who is it for? If we can go to the next slide. There are a few kind of audiences that we had in mind when we put this together. For humanitarian technologists, although we're not trying to replicate the kind of fantastic foundational work that you'll find from the Biometric Institute or other academic sources, we think this is a good basic primer on biometrics for aid. For broader technologists and tech buyers and NGOs, there are various bits of guidance on selecting tools and services. For anyone whose role has any kind of risk focus, whether that's privacy or cybersecurity or something else, there's some guidance on risk assessment and management in the course of selection and implementation. And for implementers more generally, there are a variety of bits and pieces on embedding some of the principles and guidance in their work, including organizationally. And of course, on this ecosystem point, we hope that this is a bridge to further collaboration. If we can go to the next slide. There are 4 main sections to the guidance with some appendices. So the first thing we've got is a primer. So sort of 20 or 30 pages with some foundational guidance on the tech, which references some of the fantastic foundational guidance out there, both from folks like the ICRC and Oxfam, also the Biometric Institute and others. It includes guidance on different biometric modalities, face, finger, palm, but also alignment on language and use, how and where they're incorporated into other applications, how biometric data is stored, a variety of bits of foundational knowledge that we think are necessary to make good decisions about what tech you want and how to use it safely. If we can go to the next slide, the second section in the guidance is a foundational section on risk assessment and threat modeling. There are lots of different ways to understand how stuff goes wrong. They range from tools that have been in use for decades, very general kind of good old-fashioned risk assessment, all the way through to some quite sophisticated, very specific techniques like privacy impact assessment that come from law, or threat modeling that come from the world of cybersecurity. There are lots of these, none of them are right for every circumstance. What we've tried to do in this section of the guidance is give a little bit of a foundation that introduces techniques that might be of use to you, your organization, and give you some pointers as to where you might go to learn more about them and apply them in your work. If we can go to the next slide. This third section in the guidance tries to dig into the meat of what you might need to think about and when. So not only how to think about risk, but what some of the risk types and mitigations are specific to our space, what the significance is of conflict, of broader engagement with civil society, of the kind of partnerships that one has when using biometrics for humanitarian use cases, as well as some of the ways that different contextual factors might produce social or other types of harm. And coming back to the point I made in the introduction, we also introduce a framework for starting to think about how you assess and integrate need and benefit assessment, as well as thoughts about confounding factors and outcomes into the way that you pre-deployment think about biometrics. If we go to the next slide, we have a third section on the implementation process. This digs into the sort of applied aspects of things like data storage methods, distributed data storage, privacy preserving technologies, biometric template protection, different types of cryptography, all of which make various promises and some of which will be useful for some users. Some quite classic privacy considerations, purpose limitation, data governance, data lifecycle, also some quite detailed guidance on consent and transparency. There's far more detail in this slide than probably we could go into in the webinar, but maybe we can break some of that into the Q&A. But one of the things I did want to flag here is that we've provided a reflection on consent, which for the data protection folks in the room moves away from consent the lawful basis and towards other routes, which have a slightly more nuanced treatment of how possible it genuinely is to provide service participants with any form of choice in a humanitarian intervention, essentially suggesting that there's a bit of a duty of care that's held between both parties in a way that aligns with ICRC and other guidance, which integrates into some of the guidance in the GDPR on transparency, but we think also follows the spirit of the law in suggesting that the power imbalance means that you need to approach things in a slightly more sophisticated way than sometimes we do. And lastly, we've got various considerations in the guidance that are specific to particular use cases. We've got some thoughts on cash and voucher assistance, on health, and other types of programming. If we can go to the next slide. Finally, we've got various appendices. We've got a few things that link directly to bits of the guidance that I've touched on already. We've got some guidance on different kinds of due diligence tools, when you might use penetration testing, when you might use partner due diligence and vocabulary. But drawn out in the kind of screenshot at the bottom, we've tried to map some of the guidance into a responsibility matrix, where we've said organizations should do things or implementations should do things. We've tried to articulate those into a tabular format that looks a little bit like policy lines. I'll come back to this in a second, but hopefully this gives users of the guidance not only something to read, but also a way to start to relate it back to their work. If we go to the next slide. And that kind of brings us on to how we would like you to use the guidance, or how we expect you might want to use it. If you're totally new to biometrics, it might be a good read. It's probably a useful foundation for your knowledge, for individual or team learning or capacity building. Read it, start at the beginning. Hopefully you find that it's useful in your work. If you're an organization that's already got some knowledge, if you're already implementing, if you're thinking about what organizational capacity or policy means to you as you adopt technology like this, you might want to start in a slightly different way. You might want to go straight to the safe design section. The foundational material might not be useful for you. If you're thinking about organizational capacity, you might want to start with that responsibility matrix in the appendix and use it as a guide alongside the other resources to start to think about what an organizational policy framework looks like, or what team roles and responsibilities look like for you in your implementation. If you're a grant maker or another kind of implementer, it might be that you can use the same resources for your grant making. If you're thinking more broadly about your work with others or as an ecosystem, it might be a useful tool for you to start aligning with peers, again, using that responsibility matrix, but also using some of the specific guidance in the implementation section. The last thing I wanted to touch on, if we can go to the final slide, is just coming back to the vision. They're the words we end on at the very end of the guidance. There are so many layers to doing biometrics well, which the number of layers essentially prompt the structure that we've tried to integrate into the guidance. There's no one piece of tech, transactional process, choice that you can make that means your implementation is safe. It's only going to happen as the result of a mindful, layered approach that's people-centric, that uses the right tech, that is governed in the right way, that is mindful of context, that's curious and inquiring. And we hope that the guidance gives you a way to think about that. At this point, I'm going to pause and open it up. I'm very grateful to be joined by three fantastic panelists. I'm going to ask them each in turn to spend about 5 minutes talking to us about their experience of the guidance, what their organization's perspective on biometrics are, any other thoughts that they want to bring on embodying the work. And I'll call on Marissa first from Simprints to kick us off.
Thanks, James. Hello, everyone. I'm Marissa Nordentoft, and I am Simprints' responsible data lead and data protection officer based in the UK. So just wanted to start off by saying that I know our lovely hosts, Edge and James, have already thanked the steering committee for their invaluable insights, as well as the donor for this project. But I just wanted to take a quick second to thank our behind the scenes crew here at Simprints, whom without their hard work and help, this webinar frankly would not have been possible. So a very big thank you to Seema, Raghav, and Claudia. I think some of you are on this call, but just know that we really appreciate all of your work. Okay, so to kick us off, for those who aren't very familiar with Simprints' work, I know that Edge gave a little introduction, but I think I'll take that a little bit further. So Simprints, as you know, is a technology nonprofit whose mission is to support community-based programs to radically increase transparency and accountability through not only the ethical development, but also the deployment of biometrics to help verify health service delivery. So at the current point in time, I'm really pleased to say that we've reached over 2 million beneficiaries, and we work in various countries across the world. In particularly, we have quite robust and sort of mature projects in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. And with all that being said, of course, Simprints is committed to being a responsible biometric implementer, where essentially data protection by design and by default is at the core of our work. Actually, in 2019, Simprints won the World Bank's Mission Billion Prize for innovations in data security and privacy ensuring protocols. So really, I'm happy to say that historically, this is something that has always been done at Simprints from the very beginning, and continues to be part of our human-centered design. I mean, this was even the case when we created our hardware. Not sure if you can see, but this is one of our Vero scanners. And essentially this was made through an inclusive design process where things such as the color of the LEDs, what symbols were the most clear when wanting to convey a specific message, or just the overall ergonomics of the device was created with the input of participants and future users and data subjects. So I think going on now to the handbook and what that means to Simprints, I think that the creation of the handbook was a very natural trajectory and growth point for Simprints, frankly, especially as we're slowly expanding our technology from not only being fingerprint and face, but to multi-modality as well. In addition to the fact that we'll probably be going open source at the end of the year, which means that in reality, we will lose a large portion of control over the overall implementation process. So I think looking at the handbook, for me, one of the main takeaways is that the deployment of a biometric tool is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and therefore is really not appropriate for all use cases. In some cases, it may in fact do more harm than good. And I think this, in large part, is why Simprints is so committed to mainstreaming this guidance and planting best practices and considerations more broadly throughout the humanitarian and development communities at this point in time. And a great knock-on effect would be, hopefully, the creation of a more vibrant space and community where anybody can ask questions and provide answers, all the while strengthening the overall data protection and privacy ecosystem as it currently stands. Now, the part that you've all been waiting for, the handbook. The handbook will be live on our website by the end of this webinar so that you can view, download, and share it with all of your colleagues, friends, and family. Our website is www.simprints.com/resources, where you'll be able to find it in the reports and the white paper section. Looking forward to taking any questions that you might have later on in the webinar, but otherwise I'll be passing it back to James. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Marissa. And Elizabeth, I'll call on you next to share your perspective.
Happy to. Thanks, James and everybody. I'm Elizabeth Shaughnessy. I'm the digital programs lead at Oxfam Great Britain. So I lead a team of advisors who are based internationally who support our country teams with their use of digital tools in our humanitarian and development programs. We also advise on how digital technology can itself be part of change, how it can be a lever of change in some cases in relation to ending poverty and inequality. And we also are more and more entering the space of advocacy and influencing for human rights in the context of an increasingly online and unequal world. But previously, I was on the data privacy team with James, and we worked together, years ago now, on Oxfam's biometric policy. So I joined to lead the consultation process and sign off for the policy and worked on implementation, but very early on ran into some challenges, which I'll talk about. So Oxfam's journey with biometrics starts way back in 2015, where the question of using biometrics, because they were being used already in the sector, they were becoming more and more ubiquitous. And Oxfam was faced with the question of, do we apply for funding and use biometrics with others? Do we know enough? Can we manage the risks? And ultimately the answer was, we don't know enough, we can't manage the risks. So we issued a moratorium internally on biometrics. And then to supplement that, over the next couple of years, we engaged in research. So we partnered with the Engine Room to publish research on biometrics in the humanitarian sector, which, if you haven't seen it, is still a fantastic report that came out in 2018, and it's still relevant. They've got another report coming out, I think soon, with an update to that 5 years on. But it was a fantastic report that dove into the benefits and risks, including perceived benefits and perceived risks, detailed real life use cases, and the direction of travel. And from there, we decided to write a policy, an internal policy, which has now been published, on biometrics. So that's called Oxfam's Biometric and Foundational Identity Policy. That went through a rigorous consultation process internally with our country teams and people who are technically minded or privacy minded, legal minded, and so on, and also who have experience with our programs. And it was signed off in May 2021, so actually 2 years ago. Since then, we've been looking at the implementation. So how do we bring policy to practice? And the implementation itself has actually been very, very limited. And that's because our policy is just quite conservative. And so so I think in terms of like how it reads, it goes very much from positive use case for the people who we're working with, being inclusive of people's views, their risks, both again real and perceived, this very inclusive nature of programming with biometrics, and then of course also the data protection and security requirements. And what we're finding is there are significant challenges, especially where we work in consortium or where we're facing like resource challenges. And so what I think the handbook does is helps to sort of supplement that, or as James was saying, to bridge that, where we don't have a legal requirement that is a one-size-fits-all for all organizations in all contexts, because obviously there are going to be various legal and regulatory environments. And we we don't have an internationally recognized standard on biometrics. So this is very much a useful bridge that is people-centered, that prioritizes risks, that prioritizes what people are saying about how they perceive biometrics to be used, and listens to concerns, and then also again with the actual data protection and security standards as well. And so I think it's a really great balance of nuance as well as technical guidance. And so I'm really excited about the launch. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And last but not least, Sam, please share your thoughts with us.
Thanks, James. So hi, everybody. I'm Sam Jeffries, and I have the pleasure of also being on the steering committee for the development of the handbook. I've been pleased to work with James, the team at Simprints, and the other steering committee members over the last year. And I think it's fair to say we've had a number of engaging debates. I'm really pleased with the end products, and I think it's a fair representation of our collective experience. And I'm sure it will be a really important resource for the humanitarian community going forward. In my day job, I head the Digital Services and Biometrics unit at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and have spent the better part of the last decade working with biometrics and with people to ensure that UNHCR uses biometrics ethically and responsibly in what is now more than 90 country operations worldwide, with a timeline going back more than 20 years. I strongly believe biometrics can play an important role in any humanitarian response to the benefit of our organizations and institutions, but crucially also to those who we serve and who we pledge to protect as humanitarians. At UNHCR, we do have evidence to support this, having seen greater inclusion of displaced populations in host territories, increased access to bank accounts and SIM cards, and accelerated progress towards durable solutions such as local integration and resettlement. And our programs have brought greater dignity and equity, as well as improved safety for the people we serve during the disbursement of aid and other life-saving support. I think used responsibly, biometrics have the capacity to allow us to focus our finite resources towards providing what is critically needed protection and case management services, rather than being bogged down in sometimes routine identity re-verification processes for the people we know. During my career, I've been able to work in many crisis settings alongside other UN agencies, governments and partners to identify situations where biometrics could bring tangible benefits and help the populations we collectively serve, while also considering how to reduce risks. Countless times, I think I've faced situations where, initially at least, there's not been a solid understanding on the possibilities and limitations of the technologies we've been discussing. And we've worked hard to ensure that policy and process considerations, including alternatives to biometrics, lead the discussions. I think this handbook would have been a real help in some of those situations to ensure a common baseline of understanding and more quickly achieve the breadth of considerations that are required for informed decision-making. So deploying biometrics, as we all know, is not without scrutiny from stakeholders on all sides, and nor should it be. And as a community of humanitarians, we have accountability to affected people. I'm a strong advocate for engaging with anybody who will listen to me on the subject, and ensuring transparency in how and why we process data is one of the first steps in building trust. It's obvious that processing biometrics is not appropriate for every use case, as other panelists have already touched on, especially in the humanitarian ecosystem, and nor will every individual or organization considering the use of biometrics in their programs be facing the same set of risks and opportunities. But one of the things I think of many that we've done well in the handbook is find the balance for these considerations. I think we wanted to ensure that the handbook was prescriptive where it made sense to be, but not to the point of excluding the handbook's usability for some other stakeholders. I think it provides excellent food for thought, whether you're just starting to consider using biometrics or are already active implementers. The handbook, as James mentioned, also aligns well with other respected resources, such as the Biometrics Institute's 3 Laws of Biometrics covering policy, process, and technology, as well as the Institute's Good Practice Framework and the World Bank's Primer on Biometrics. And resources like this handbook prompts greater awareness of the challenges we all face and helps us to build a stronger, more aware and more responsible community of practitioners and decision makers. In terms of how I think listeners should use the handbook going forward, and to echo comments from other panelists so far, I'd encourage everybody to read and reflect and take action where needed. And I also hope the handbook itself prompts discussion within and across organizations considering the use of biometrics. The handbook should not get dusty on a shelf. As those online will already know, the world of biometrics is continually evolving, opening up doors of opportunity, but also new risks we must consider on a continual basis. And once a system has been deployed, or a decision has been taken for whatever reason to not deploy, that should not be the end of the conversation. So this handbook should be a prompt for responsible re-examination of past decisions on a continual basis to ensure that we all do our best to support those most in need. So once again, thanks Simprints for bringing to life this important resource, and thanks also for organising today's launch event.
Amazing. Thanks, Sam and others. I'm going to pass the baton now back to Edge, who I think is going to take us through questions from the audience.
Thanks, James. Apologies, I was having problems unmuting myself. Thank you very much, panel, for that really insightful discussion. There's some questions I have, so I'm just going to kick off straight away and just pose the first question to the panel. So the first question I have is from Austin McGee. My sense has been for some time that the work Simprints has done around privacy protocols is groundbreaking, and much of it is applicable well beyond the use of biometrics. In fact, everyone involved in being a data controller or processor. How do you feel about the usefulness of the handbook beyond biometrics? And totally open to the panel. James?
Yeah,
I can see
start
you.
with that one. Some of it's definitely relevant. It's always a challenge putting together structured guidance like this that builds on other areas of practice, that you have these horrible choices. Do I summarize the whole of data protection in my guidance or refer to it? Do I draw out bits from it? You'll see in the handbook itself, we make reference to and use of lots of established guidance as well as legal frameworks, which are relevant to broader tech for dev, but quite selectively. So we treat, for example, purpose limitation quite heavily, because one of the challenges we know with biometrics is that having collected data for one purpose, it's very easy to use it for another. Your primary purpose might be healthcare, but the secondary purpose might be something quite unintended, which is oppressive or harmful. So the treatment that we give to the way data is managed is heavily flavored by humanitarian biometric use cases in a way that means that a lot of the guidance probably is translatable, but we've not written it with those other use cases in mind. So it just comes with that kind of safety warning, I think. And what I'll also say is there are some other fantastic guides on this that you'll find. You know, the ICRC Data Protection Handbook for Humanitarian Action is fantastic. The guidance recently put out, updated by the Interagency Steering Committee on Data Responsibility, is really good. So I wouldn't necessarily promote it for that, but I imagine anyone that's using it will probably get some benefit from it for, you know, non-biometric use cases as well.
Thank you very much, James, for that. Does any of the panel have anything else to add? If not, I can take from one more person before I move on.
I'll come in, and I don't want to echo what James has said too much, but I think even just looking at the way that the document's been structured introduces a breadth of considerations which are useful to many other circumstances. Yeah, James mentioned the other documents that have been referenced, but I think often when examining other technologies, the considerations we've undertaken here are still relevant. So as a baseline, and certainly better than not having anything, this can be a really good and really positive thing to help shape thinking and make sure we're thinking to each of the corners of what needs to be considered. Also, an important point to add is that sometimes biometrics isn't the right choice. So when you're looking at other implementations, it may be that biometrics is the right choice or isn't the right choice. So again, following the process and the considerations which are laid out in the handbook doesn't necessarily lead you to a conclusion that you're going to deploy biometrics.
Thank you very much, Sam. So just to pose another question, I wonder if any of the panelists have any further reflections on how we get this vital people-centric component right. How can we be transparent, accountable, and provide meaningful choice at the sharp end of collection? I'm just going to open it to any of the panel who want to jump in and take that one.
I'll give it a job. Oop.
Go ahead, Marissa.
Go on, Marissa.
I'll just be fast. I think one of the most important things is making sure that everything that you have in theory is being translated into practice, because you may have certain ideas about writing privacy notices, how do you go about doing informed consent, putting it into the correct language, but then when you get to the field, the user of the biometric tool may not actually be practicing those. So I think that's a very important gap that people need to get better at. And then onto you, James, to add what you wanted to say.
Thanks, Marissa. It's a really tricky one, and that's a good reflection. We had the sort of the debate everyone will have heard if they've been to any panel on responsible data in the last 5 years extensively in the steering committee is, how do we do informed consent? What does it mean in the context of an environment where the power differential between an implementer and the recipient of some service or distribution is enormous? I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's pretty clear to me anyway, and I think most of the panelists would probably agree that in the sense meant by the GDPR, by European law, pure consent doesn't work. You can't give people this free libertarian choice that they engage with your intervention, which means that you're looking at something that's much more nuanced. You're looking at a mixture of, how do you communicate to people what you're going to do? How do you reevaluate that when it might change? What does that mean in terms of transparency? To what extent can you ensure that you're able to undertake purpose limitation? How will that evolve over time? And then how do you evaluate it? So from a policy standpoint, we suggest pretty clearly that consent in a data protection sense probably isn't right. However, a mixture of talking to people about what you're going to do, of offering them choice where you can, of recognizing that it's not always going to be possible to give them choice. There may not be alternatives in some circumstances, and therefore the organizations also hold what is effectively a duty of care towards people when working with data is the model we suggest, which I think is broadly in line with, if you look at the ICRC guidance, it says basically the same thing. It's in line with the policy line we chose at Oxfam, but I think that's the direction that we kind of suggest people go in. I mean, I know others on the panel, it's a really good question. I know others on the panel will have kind of reflections about this too, so I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, James. Is there anything else from anyone on the panel before I move on? Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really well said already, but I think, and I do agree. I think informed consent is I won't say never, but almost never going to be the most inappropriate legal basis for using biometrics. And in general, the context that we work in humanitarian and development programs or crisis response, there's always going to be this power imbalance. I think maybe another thing to add is that in many of the places where we collectively work, it's not often that we're sort of diving in unannounced, and this is like the first time and then initiating a biometrics program. I think more often we're looking at we've already been building relationships with communities for several years, or we've had a presence in a country or in a context. There have been other initiatives, other programs. And so I think it's important to understand within the history of your own programming experience, within the history of, we're often working in consortium and partnership with other organizations, partnership with local organizations. So there's, in addition to there already being nuance when it comes to consent, there's also nuance in the context itself with the partnerships that you have, how everyone is working together for some desired outcome. And I guess just to acknowledge that what the handbook does really well is incorporates the voices and concerns of people who we were meant to be working with and for, and by having that sort of people-centered approach, it should be kind of continuously building, continuously listening, building in mechanisms that can capture feedback in real time, over time, and to really see what people are saying and feeling, and to continue building programs that incorporate those responses. And so I think that heavily supplements this sort of question around consent. If we were to look at other legal bases, at least in GDPR terms anyway, it is really challenging. There isn't really one that fits. And if we sort of rely on legitimate interest, which is the only other kind of logical one to look at in most cases, that does imply a certain amount of robust documentation rather than it being the catch-all. So I guess that's just something else to keep in mind.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elizabeth. James, I'm going to come to you now. Are there any lessons in a space which has no shortage of fast-moving emerging technologies, from blockchain to generative AI, which we can apply from the journey of humanitarian biometrics?
I think, and I make this point a lot when people ask me questions like this, for me, it's a question of intentionality. Being good at anything requires work. Being fit and healthy requires that you put the right things into your body and you take exercise. Being a morally good person requires that you make difficult choices, that you're thoughtful about the way that you do it. It doesn't happen by accident. New technology often makes broad and spectacular claims about social impact, some of which have the potential to be realized, but only if we do it thoughtfully, only if we have the right structure. I often use metaphors like automotive engineering or architecture. You wouldn't go into a building expecting it to be safe climbing up the stairs without having commissioned a structural engineer to design your skyscraper, without having commissioned somebody who understands the right building material to use. And yet we do this with technology. We spin things up, we deploy it without taking the same care that we would expect had been applied to putting airbags in our car. And it seems sometimes like it's the same lesson that we're learning with lots of new technology, that without the right intentionality, without the right structure for being thoughtful, for designing, for doing privacy by design, for consulting people, you're not going to achieve the results that you want. And that it's quite an interesting moment, I think, to be having that discussion in the kind of a moment where I think, ethical impact of technology has never been quite so saturated in our media coverage. ChatGPT and generative AI happening kind of left, right, and center. And there are some technical bits of this guidance that are, only applicable to biometrics. Biometric template protection is clearly not applicable to generative AI unless you're doing biometrics. But a lot of this other stuff, and to Sam's point about the structure, thinking about the needs and benefit, a lot of these tools, a lot of these, kind of lessons we're learning from years of implementation, I think are directly relevant. And in fact, some of them we've ripped off and co-opted from other places. The need and benefit assessment. Appendix comes from a previous bit of guidance written by Siobhan Green, who's also on the steering committee, and Sarah Greaves, who on the webinar as well. An earlier piece of guidance on kind of using biometrics for COVID action. So, that it's that structural intentionality piece, I think, for me, that is really key. And if we can learn that and apply it into other, areas of technology, whatever impact we make on biometrics, I think that's a good thing.
Thank you very much, James. Just want to remind the audience that the handbook is now live at simprints.com/resources. So please do download it and share it widely. And I'll carry on. I think this is a question that comes up quite a lot. I don't think there's a definitive answer, but it'd be really good to hear your take, panel, on this. So, one of the claimed benefits from using biometrics is minimizing fraud and deduplicating aid recipients. It seems, however, there is scant evidence of biometrics being better at this than other less privacy intrusive and risky methods. Do you have any leads of robust research on this issue? Let me go to... I don't mind. I was just going to pick on somebody, but if anyone's got anything really pertinent to say, Sam, I'm going to pick on Sam because I can see Sam on top of my screen right now.
Sure. Thanks, and a really good question, and not one that we've not heard before as well. I think it's as James said in his opener, I think there's not enough public information on some of the benefits that have been brought through the use of biometrics, this being one of them. Certainly where we've introduced biometrics, I think there's an independent study done by one of the UN external sort of oversight services in 2013, looking at the before and after of introducing biometrics to aid distribution scenarios in Kenya. And it states that the savings that the organizations were making per month were in excess of $1 million a month for food that wasn't being diverted. So that's a lot of mouths that we can feed with extra resources just in that one example. So are there other controls that can be used to achieve the same aim? I think that's the key question, which you asked in as part of the question you put forward there. And in some situations, absolutely there are, yes. However, I think in other situations, and sadly, many of the situations that we work in as humanitarians, there simply aren't common identifiers that can be used at the onset of a crisis. So it's challenging to make sure that we've got we do that risk balance, that risk management sort of calculation, and work out how we can best quickly and efficiently and with dignity anchor somebody to something that we know about them or something that they hold. At the end of the day, we're all here to protect and serve the people who need it most, and we need to make sure that we can see most people and make sure that our assistance and our services reach the most people who are in need. So I think there's still still a lot of evidence that suggests that the rollout of biometrics has been done and continues to bring benefits across different operations in which we all work. And I think also, if you start to look beyond just the scenario of or the points raised around fraud management or fraud reduction rather, and look to some of the other benefits that biometrics can bring in terms of inclusion in state systems for people on the move, and broader sort of meeting KYC requirements to get people back into the financial ecosystem. I think the benefits, the sort of knock-on benefits of rolling out biometrics can also be very noteworthy, and a number of studies have been conducted in that area. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam. Elizabeth, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, so I mentioned this before, but the engine room is planned on having some additional research coming out as a follow-up on the 2018 research they've done with us. So really looking forward to that. They had a community call a few months ago, but I think now we're just waiting for the final report. So other than that, I don't really know. Robust research, not in my experience, but I think part of this is because we haven't had something as a sector that grounds us all to like, okay, we're going to agree to this common problem statement and work off of that. I think there's sort of been positive use cases put forward. There's been evidence against them. There's been negative use cases that have been publicized in the media. There's just been sort of this clash of messages rather than, I feel, a steady ongoing conversation about the practicalities of what the real risks are, what the real benefits are, and documenting that in a communal way. So I'd love to hear positive use cases, and I think that's something that the handbook will help with engaging those conversations. I think also it'd be really useful to understand where biometrics were decided not to be used. I think that there's I don't know if this is just because there's too much pressure from doing it wrong that we're not allowing ourselves the space to really explore, where we might have failed or where we've made other decisions or where there have been real benefits in measuring those and how we measure those and making sure that we're able to open ourselves up to scrutiny. So a long-winded way of saying, no, I don't, other than the engineering research, but I'd love to see it. I'd love to see more and more documentation on this that is openly shared. And I think that the handbook is a great way of establishing that conversation.
I've got some thoughts on this one too.
Thank you. I was just going to come to you, James.
Amazing.
Did you share your thoughts?
I mean, many of them have been taken already. Part of the problem of being on a panel with smart people is they get to the good ideas quicker than you do. But I'm going to drill down on that point Elizabeth made, that it's the right question, and it's a question that comes up a lot, to Sam's point as well. But it's a question we should keep coming back to as a community and in a more aligned way, because we should have evidence for needs for benefit for kind of impact on communities. Many people on the call will know there's been some amazing research into various aspects of use of biometrics, digital identity. There's been some great ethnographic research, some of which we reference on individual experiences. It doesn't touch on the bit of the question which is about fraud. I would love to see more detailed investigation on fraud statistics based on biometrics. I think there's an open question mark for me there, certainly. It's sort of case unproven sometimes. But there is quite a good body of evidence on effectiveness for other things. And actually the Simprints team is a great team to talk to about this. There's a great project on cluster randomized HIV trials which use biometrics, which is an incredibly large scale use of them, which probably which enabled clinical outcomes and enabled research to be carried out that probably wouldn't have been possible without biometrics at all, just based on the properties of the data. Where I know the study lead was relatively glowing when I talked to them about what the impact had been for them. But I think also part of the problem is we're probably not very good at an ecosystem at collating some of it together, and hopefully the engineering work and work by others will kind of help us move towards a point where we're a little bit more aligned. But it's some of the health stuff. If you're looking for studies today, health is where I would look. There is some work that's been done on kind of effectiveness that has positive shows positive results. But I'd love to see some negative results too. You know, just how challenging that is in sort of scientific research. People don't want to publish that kind of.
Thank you, James. Before I move on, Marissa, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, James covered Simprints' example.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, let me go on to take another question. I wonder if any of the panelists, sorry, I've asked that question. How do we meaningfully work with communities whose data we collect as implementers? How would we meaningfully work with communities whose data we collect as implementers? I suppose that question is asking the question around how would we ensure the security, how would we ensure that the data was safe, how would we ensure that it was used in a meaningful way, and how would we, I suppose, convince the communities that the way in which we're using the data. That's my interpretation of what the question is asking. Anyone on the panelists want to take that one?
I'm sure we all may have something to say, but I'm happy to kick things off.
Sure.
I think we've got to lead with transparency, and we need to be upfront and proactive in the way we communicate with people to make sure that they are understanding and communicated to in ways which are in ways that they can understand, and also that it's not just a sort of one-way street of communication from us to them about what we intend to do, but that the consultations we have with people who we are interacting with are truly two-way, and that there is room for the conversations that we have with those people to be to make meaningful change in the way in which we design and implement our programs. I think that sort of transparency in what we're doing is, as I said in my opening statement earlier, one of the most important things we can do to start to build trust, but also giving a voice to the people and making sure that we're being people-centric in the way we design and deliver our programs is also of huge importance. So giving agency to people to be able to speak to us about what their concerns are, to make sure that we take into consideration any risks that we may not have considered from our perspective, and to make sure that the programs we're designing are fully supportive of their aims and their concerns is of utmost importance.
Thank you, Sam.
Sorry, last point. I think one thing which is also super important, given the audience of this call, is that we do this messaging in a way which is joined up, and often we all sort of may fly into the latest sort of humanitarian emergency from different agencies, from different organizations, different different fields of expertise, but really there may only be sort of one individual or one group of individuals that we're all looking to support. So I think the other piece of the puzzle is making sure that we're doing things in a joined up way, not just designing our programs, but also communicating with those with affected communities, with affected people, to make sure that we're delivering the most efficient and most understandable and most well designed humanitarian response that we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. I will just allow one other panel member to come in if one other person has anything else to add before I move on.
I'll give others first refusal first, but if not, okay, it might be me.
James is speaking.
Maybe connecting it practically back to the guidance. There are a few sections we treat this. I kind of touched on it in the introduction, but the transparency and consent section of the guidance, one of the things we do is there's a table with Article 15 of the GDPR, so the article that deals directly with what you should tell people in your privacy notices. And we try not just to treat that as prescriptive, but to think about what each of the things means that you tell people, what it means to tell someone about the controller's identity, what it means to tell someone about the lawful basis, to give people tools for the very transactional piece to kind of do it maybe a little bit more thoughtfully. But sort of Sam's and others' points, there are so many layers here, and it needs fundamentally to be a thoughtful sort of research-based piece. So if you look in the guidance on page 49 to 50 in the sort of consultation section, we also suggest sort of different stages where engagement is important prior to design, or during design, prior to deployment, as part of some kind of human-centered design approach, maybe as part of your kind of meal plan, as part of the rollout itself, again, probably as part of your meal plan, but also as sort of you pilot and you kind of go to scale up, and then also sort of broader consultation with civil society. So a few places we try and treat this and give what we think might be best practice for a sort of layered approach, which is a bit less transactional, if that's a helpful, more practical take.
Thank you, James. And finally, I'm just quite a short question, but quite an in-depth one. But I'm going to just ask each of the panel to just answer, very quickly in a few seconds. What is the biggest challenge to deploying biometrics responsibly? In your opinion, obviously. I can see your thought from there. So what is the biggest challenge? So I'm just going to go in order. James, you're muted, so that's perfect. Sorry, unmuted. So that tells me you want to speak first. So go for it. And then I'm going to come to Marissa next.
My answer to that these days is usually money. Not to say that this or any other technology is particularly expensive, but we've moved into this bit of the 21st century where we use man-made, very complicated applied bits of mathematics to do useful and beautiful things. And we haven't always considered that we need to budget for using them well and effectively, and not just the license cost or the hardware cost, but the sustainability cost and the training cost and digitally upskilling our staff and doing it with our partners, which when you're a humanitarian organization working with a range of implementing organizations can be really tricky. So I think fundamentally it's the cost. It's that the cost exists in the system and people are realistic about what resource they need to bring to bear to actually be respectful, and hopefully the guidance helps to, by providing structure around what that looks like, get people a bit closer to a conception of what it truly means to incorporate that total cost into their work, whether they're an implementer or a funder or something else.
Thank you, Marissa. And just for warning, Elizabeth, I'm going to come to you after Marissa.
Thanks, Edge. In my opinion, it would definitely be balancing your organization's own internal standards for deploying biometrics vis-a-vis what legislation or frameworks may or may not exist in the country that you're trying to deploy the tool, because a lot of the times those may be at odd, and then trying to find a common solution between the two way forward.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Well, those are two challenges that I would have mentioned. I think aside from those, time is another resource that I think is undervalued in our sector. If we're not given the time to properly do something, it's not going to be done properly. And I think that a lot of that can trace back to the ecosystem that you're working within, and that includes like donor requirements and how quickly you have to get a program off the ground to be in line with your, the donation you've been given. And likewise, who are your partners? Are you working with the government? Are you working with organizations that have conflicting internal policies? And that's definitely a challenge.
Thank you. And finally, Sam.
Thanks. Some great suggestions so far. I mean, for me, if I had to name one that wasn't already named, I'd go on I'd say sustainability as well, making sure that after you've had that initial effort to deploy a system to a particular use case, that you still are able to maintain the skills in the workforce, the governance around decision making and oversight, and continue to do the reassessment that we've spoken about so many times today already, to make sure that the use of the technology is proportionate and appropriate for what it is you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. And I think that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you very much once again to Sam, to James, to Marissa and Elizabeth for being great panelists and answering all the questions that have been put to you all. Thank you everybody for joining us and taking the time to come and listen on this really important and quite topical conversation. Please do download the handbook. It is now live on the Simprints website, simprints.com/resources, and you just scroll down to the bottom and it's there for you. Keep in touch with us, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, email us if you have any other questions. And also, yes, of course, thanks to IBM Notre Dame Ethics Lab for funding this. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can carry on the discussion at another time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, goodbye.